I'm Paul Givens. Welcome to Leading and Managing Change in the 21st Century. A lot of what we're going to cover is in my recently published book, The Science of Successful Organizational Change, which was briefly among the bestsellers on Amazon in Leading Change. And so we're going to take you through what would take you a couple of weeks to read in something like a day. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of how to lead change in the 21st century, I'm going to talk a little bit about the why it's so important, and what that means for people who think about business strategy and also business ethics. So in about 2 decades ago, the U.S. Army War College began to talk about a concept called VUCA. And it's not some rare venereal disease, but in fact, VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And they used it to refer to war zones where the level of complexity and volatility was unlike they had ever seen before. This has been seized upon by the business community as an example of how the business world is changing in the 21st century, and we need to be more capable, more agile, and better at leading change. And so if you want an example, you can look no further than Shanghai. This is Shanghai in 1990. As you can see, there's some farmlands, there's lots of greens, there's lots of ancient buildings, and lots of low-rises. And then in only 2 decades, look what China has done with that city. Shanghai now the most populous city in the world. Of course, we have, at our disposal incredible technology, and people predict today that robotics is going to transform our lives, and that will no longer remove the drudgery of houseworks and a lot of the more dangerous occupations that with which mankind have to toil at the moment. But we also talk about risks. You know, we have Professor Stephen Hawking from Cambridge and entrepreneur Elon Musk and a group of 100 other scientists signing a document which basically says they're worried about the rise of strong artificial intelligence. So like all things that confront the business world today, we have a lot of benefits and a lot of risks. And medical science is perhaps one area which has grown more rapidly during the last quarter of a century than nearly anything else. And we have examples today of children which are born today in 2015. It's probable that most of them will live to 100 years old, that the majority of them will live to 100 years old. So that's an incredible thing, but then also we're now capable of altering not only the genome of bacteria and of plants, but we're also capable of altering our own genome, which leads to these science fiction scenarios that until now have only been confined to the movies. 75% of the world today lives in cities, a number which has been accelerating greatly. And you see on the left what a city of the 21st century could look like with lots of green parks and clean water and something which looks environmentally. This is the reality today as people migrate to cities, as they're unable to cope. When I grew up, London, Tokyo, and New York were the largest cities in the world. Now they don't make it into the top 10. Yes, places like Lagos, Delhi, Shanghai, and Karachi have overtaken them. And some of these agglomerations, these urban agglomerations, have more than 20 million people today. So those are some of the challenges in the bigger world. And the question is, of course, we're in a course on business, is how do they affect the business world? We have an example here of an ethical failure with the Deepwater Horizon, which some estimate will cost $1 trillion to British Petroleum in damage over the lifetime. And we also have the crash of 2008, where numbers of bankers thought that they could successfully manage risk, and we found out that to our enormous cost, the greatest recession in 70 years was precipitated by effectively leadership hubris and inattention to ethical issues. And so what does all this mean in terms of the bigger picture for business today? And there's 2 things, the 2 very exciting concepts. One of them is this notion of human flourishing, which 2,000 years ago was called eudaimonia, which means that there's more to life than just happiness. And some of the things that we need to think about in any picture of human well-being or any picture of flourishing are spiritual fulfillment, their engagement with tasks, what some psychologists call flow or some athletes call being in the zone, achievement and the desire of human beings to climb the Everests of the world and land on the moon. And we also need to consider the importance of human relationships. That last one is when they study longevity and health outcomes over 5 centuries, what they find is that the people with the healthiest relationships, it predicts both longevity and health and productivity over a lifetime. So these are the 5 dimensions of this new idea of human flourishing, which is now making its way in the business world. And the other thing that we need to pay attention to is the notion that businesses should just make money for the sake of making money is now thought of principally as being an absurd idea. And research shows that businesses that manage a triple bottom line of profits, people, and planet outperform financially businesses that focus exclusively on the bottom line. Let me say that again. So it seems paradoxical that if you focus on planet, people, and profits, you actually do better than companies that just focus on profits. So it's not a win-lose, it's a win-win. And so these are some of the concepts that are affecting business leaders today. And we have, I think, a new class of leader, very exciting, but great leadership for ethical enterprises, maximal and wise deployment of science and wisdom to human flourishing in a sustainable world. And this is the kind of virtuous cycle and the challenge, I think, for prospering in the VUCA context that I talked about. So that's very high level. And now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of how to make change happen, when it fails, how it fails, and then what we can do about that to try and improve our own return on change investment. Unlike many consultants, I'm going to talk not about my change successes, but I'm going to start with talking about my change failure. It goes back to 1993 when I was a young, wet behind the ears consultant in London, and I went to work in Barclays Bank. We have there as an example of a securities trading room. They had armies and armies of derivatives traders using mathematics to trade complex instruments. I was brought in with a group of people from around the world to help them decide how to manage risk. And so we went in and we interviewed Barclays, and at the end of our 3-month project, my first consulting project, we wrote them a report and we charged them about $4 million for the report. They did absolutely nothing with it. So we took the report around to the board, to the executive committee, to the business units heads. They studied the report, they loved our work, they thought our work was accurate, precise, useful, and they did nothing with it. So the question in my mind was, of course, what besides good ideas, what besides recommendations, what besides expertise gets change to happen in the real world? And that's one question. And the second question is, when are they going to blow the whistle on consultants who charge $4 million and then swan off to the next assignment without actually delivering business results to clients? So I began to study back then, and it's one of the tables for my book is that how often does change fail? And we find that some change succeeds about 50% of the time, but if you try more difficult business change, particularly culture change, it may only succeed between 20 and 30% of the time. Well, those are horrible numbers, and they should give us cause to wake up for a minute and ask, if you're trying to calculate the return on investment for a change, are you taking into account that nearly half the time on average, the change won't produce the results you want? And so what we found in the change world is that while the world, the pace of change is growing in this VUCA way, exponentially, we have the human and behavioral sciences in the last quarter of a century have really, really grown and taught us a lot about how humans change and learn. We have change management theory, which in my view hasn't moved at all. We're still using the same hackneyed theories from 20, 30, 40, and 50 years ago. There's still the world of change is populated by myth. And what I'm going to try and do during the next day is talk about some of those change myths and how some of this, what we're learning in the human behavioral sciences, is going to really make a difference, a really practical difference in how we manage change in business. So one of the greatest myths about change is that, and it comes from one of the earliest change theorists, a guy called Kurt Lewin, in the 1950s, said that what you need to do to manage change is you need to unfreeze, you need to move, and then you need to refreeze. And I think this idea, which is still pervasive today, people still talk about Levin's change model, is quite ridiculous. That's why, is it really true that any part of an organization is frozen? It's a metaphor, right? So they're not literally frozen. So you have to think about, is it frozen? Because from my point of view, it's more like what Greek philosopher Heraclitus said, everything flows. Everything is moving always. A new hire, a new promotion, a new business challenge, a new initiative from on high. When I've done research in businesses and I've interviewed middle managers, very often, if I ask them how many change projects are you managing formally at the moment, they will generally say between 5 and 15. So they're either leading change themselves, they're affected by change that's led somewhere else, there's centrally driven change from the executive team on downwards that they have to implement at a local level, or some of their staff are leading and managing change, and they have to cope with that. They're awash with change, and so this idea that organizations are frozen, and then we unfreeze them, and then we move them, is one of the most harmful ideas. And why is it a harmful idea? One of the things that happens when you teach people that change is an exception and not the rule, in other words, you teach people that change, the world is stable and it's punctuated by change. When people encounter change, it's like being cut off in traffic by a crazy driver. The world shouldn't be that way. And what you do when you teach people that change is an exception is you set them at war with reality. But the other, and this is something that's very close to my heart since I teach in a lot of business schools. Here we have the Harvard Business School. What do we teach people about change and about leading change at the Harvard Business School? Well, they have 100 electives in their MBA program. It's still one of the best in the world. Only one of those 100 electives is on leading and managing change, and it's nothing about leading and managing change is in the 16 mandatory modules that you do in a Harvard MBA. And I've studied business schools around the world, and it's more or less the case that you can leave with the best business educations in the world without learning anything about leading and managing change. And we have to ask ourselves, does that reflect the reality of the day-to-day life of a business leader today? And I think it doesn't. I think because most of what they do, I say it's not 80% of their activities, but it's 80% of their headaches are around leading and managing change. And so we need ways of analyzing failures, and one of the things we're going to talk about a little later in the program is shortfalls, when programs don't produce, they only produce 80% or 60% of the benefits, cost overruns, which can sometimes be 100 or 200%, unintended consequences, the change succeeds, but there are consequences that are costly for later on. We talk about programs that are written off entirely. And we're talking about programs that produce results, but then there's backsliding when behaviors revert to how they were before the change. And so that's some of what we're going to talk about when we talk about change myths. And here is another table from the book, which presents some of the research on each of these categories of change failures. Again, we're going to go into that a little bit later. And so one of the interesting studies is from a company very near to my heart, IBM. It's one of my favorite companies in the world. And they did some research which showed that there was a group of change masters which can actually produce 80% success rates on the change they implement, but there was a group of change novices in their study that only succeeded 20% of this time. That's an extraordinary number. If you really think about it, the amount of change that's launched in business, to have change only succeed 20% of the time is quite an extraordinary number. And if we do the math, we look at these change master organizations, most of the outcomes that they're producing are on the right side of the distribution, are positive outcomes, but if you look at the ROI from the change novices, then most of the outcomes they're producing are negative. That's a very important consequence for capital management and the way we run organizations today. So, in conclusion, we need 100% clarity, I think. We need to stare the monster in the face and learn how our individual businesses fare at managing change. Are we more in the change master category or more in the change novice category? And the second thing is we need to understand what change masters are doing that change novices are not doing. And one of the concepts I think is most important is going to be the subject of the next hour, is going to be change agility. Thank you.